Hello, I'm Mark Ellen. Thanks for clicking this word in your ear, the latest of hundreds of conversations David Hepworth and I have had on this podcast we started 17 years ago. Some with ourselves, others with musicians, authors, comedians, and other people we like. If you enjoy them and want to support us and keep it all coming and get extra entertainment, including the weekly quiz and a special event on your birthday, visit patreon.com/wordinyour-ear or just like or subscribe in whatever way you prefer. Well, welcome to this, and an old pal of ours from our magazine days who's written a really brilliant and original and extremely touching book about his connection with his son through music and how it changed their lives. And the book's called Maybe I'm Amazed, A Story of Love and Connection in 10 Songs. And it's John Harris. John, it's lovely to see you again.
And you. It's been too long.
It's been too long. It has. Well, look, before we get on to the book, just a bit about your background for people who don't know, just your background in music and how you got into the music press. I mean, can you remember the first record you bought?
I can. It could have been the Bucket of Water song by the cast of Tiswas.
Oh, right. Okay.
I had a kind of near miss with that one, but it was actually Strangetown by the Jam, which is makes me out to be a much cooler 9-year-old than I was when I bought that. But I was on holiday in Edinburgh with my parents, and in those days, Boots sold records. You will remember.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And I was allowed to go into Boots and buy a single, and I think I'd heard that on the radio, and I bought that. And that was it was a good start.
That's precocious, actually, isn't it, as a first record?
Yeah, but it was like a lot of the best singles then. It was sort of replete with fascination and information. The B-side is The Butterfly Collector, which is really, really good. And it had one of Paul Weller's poems on the back. So this little 7x7 thing, you know, when you're 9 years old, it kept me going for about a month, you know.
Yeah.
And what about the Beatles?
The information value in records, you know, when you're that age is just extraordinary, isn't it?
It's astonishing. But by the same token, if the B-side was crap, I would literally feel sick. Like, whoa, 75p, and the B-side's crap.
You felt robbed, didn't you?
Absolutely robbed.
See, the way the attitude should be that you paid 75p for the A-side and everything else is a bonus. But and if it happened to be good, that's great. But no, you saw it differently.
No, and fair play to the Jam. They were very, very good at giving you an interesting B-side. There's that bit in Ian MacDonald's Revolution in the Head where he talks about the art of the B-side. I think in relation to Old Brown Shoe by the Beatles.
Yeah.
And they're the best singles, aren't they? The ones where you turn it over and you get something you really weren't expecting.
Yeah, definitely.
You know my name, look up the number.
Exactly.
So on the Beatles point, you were born in 69, so you were born pretty much at the point where they were splitting up. And that's a lot of the book is about the Beatles and your relationship and James's relationship with the Beatles. So how did you discover them?
When I was 5 years old, my mum, I don't know whether she'd gone out to work or something, but she left me with one of her friends for the day. And to shut me up, I would imagine, she presented me with Sgt. Pepper and the cutouts. And I think she gave me a pair of scissors, which is a silly thing to do. And so I cut the moustache out and put the bits up my nostrils and all that. But one of my first memories, certainly my first musical memories, is of sitting there, hearing Within You, Without You at the start of side 2 and being just completely bowled over by it and transported somewhere else. And it's sort of fusing with the colours on the record sleeve, particularly the red on the back, you know, the back with the lyrics is just a lovely shade of red and everything kind of cohering. And I just kind of thought, well, I want more of this. And my dad quite soon after started taking me to Wilmslow Library on a Friday night. I grew up in suburban Cheshire. And you could borrow albums for 25p a pop.
Yes.
So I just got all the Beatles albums, one after the other. I think I had to order a few of them in, but and I was gone, you know. And I'm still there now. I haven't left that moment, really. That's still where you
really is extraordinary. I love the idea that it's Within You, Without You. Of all the available tracks, you know, because most people, those were the ones people skipped, actually, if we're being honest, which is terrible looking back on it. But
I still find that fascinating. It sort of ebbs and flows Within You, Without You. There's a false ending, and It goes on for quite a while by the standards of Beatles songs, doesn't it?
By the standards of the time, it did.
So you already saw it at that age as a kind of, as a kind of video in your head, a kind of big explosion of.
It's just like this has nothing to do with my surroundings. This is from somewhere else, and I want to get further into it. I mean, the great thing about hearing records prior to your teens, really, when all those notions of cool and what's in and what's out arrive, is that there's a sort of purity to the way you hear things.
Yeah,
You're just hearing it almost as its creator intended, and so your capacity to have your mind blown is huge. It's sort of unfiltered the way it goes in. I mean, can you imagine hearing I think I heard A Day in the Life when I was 6 or 7. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I couldn't believe that even existed somehow.
You fix on certain songs, as indeed James does, and we'll talk about that later, but you fix on certain songs that you become really obsessed with. I think Sir Duke, Baker Street, and stuff by Happy Mondays.
That's later on. Go on.
Yeah, but what was it particularly about songs like Sir Duke that you were so excited by?
The power of those songs must be indicated by the fact that I remember these moments of first hearing them. So I vividly remember sitting in my dad's car when he'd gone to the dry cleaning place in Hale Barnes. The only other person who'd know any of these reference points that you have on your program is Miranda Sawyer, who grew up in the same town as me. But
right.
He went to Hale Barnes to have his dry cleaning done, and he left me in the car with Radio Piccadilly on, which was the local station in Manchester. And again, can you imagine just hearing that with absolutely no warning, especially the horn breakdowns?
Yeah.
It's an astonishing piece of music. And the same's true of Baker Street. Baker Street was slightly different in as much as I had this sense from Baker Street that it was about being an adult. And it was about quite difficult, somewhat unsettling aspects of being an adult, which it is, right? It's about sort of dead-end lives and people who are sort of trying to find their way into something better and can't and all that. And I wouldn't have been able to tell you that, obviously, but I got some sense from it. And it sort of fused in Baker Street. I mean, talking about Baker Street, it's a very sort of cliched record that I'm sure in certain circles it's very verboten to rhapsodize about records like that. But it's brilliant, Baker Street.
It is.
Oh, it
is.
Don't you think also the truth is when you're younger, all records are novelty records, aren't they? Because you haven't heard a million things in that genre.
No, exactly.
It's a comedy record and Sir Duke, kind of similarly strange and stimulating, aren't they?
If they both do what they're intended to do, yeah. I mean, I was fascinated by My Boomerang Won't Come Back by Charlie Drake.
Yes.
But that thing, which you have to be very old to remember. But I think that was slightly earlier. But you're absolutely right. The sort of power of music to completely knock you sideways.
Yeah.
When there's no mediation, that's the point. No one said, "Oh, listen to this." You just find it. And the other thing was, it was quite difficult to follow it up and then go and find it again to listen to. I wasn't buying records at that time.
No, quite.
So you sort of heard it once and you thought, well, when am I going to hear that again? And you didn't.
Absolutely.
That's the thing about
and you wondered if you'd
needle
imagined
time on
British
radio, isn't it? You might go weeks before you heard it again.
Yeah. That's what happened. I remember hearing Baker Street and then not hearing it again for 6 months.
And then when you would hear it again, you'd turn on the radio and it would already be playing, which was mildly frustrating at the same time.
You missed a bit.
Because it's quite interesting because this is an experience, and you touch on this in your book with James, that we now live in a world where you can call up any tune from the beginning, wherever you are in the world, you can do it. Whereas that never was the case before, was it?
Yeah, that remains to me sort of mind-boggling and magical. It's completely ordinary to my kids.
Yeah, this is it. And
the other way around, they think records are amazing and Spotify's normal.
Yes,
that's true.
Yes, when you play a record, they go, watch it going round. Look at that.
How does that? They go, what, this plastic thing? Yeah, that's how it works.
I had to explain to my kids why the gaps in between the songs tracks were a different colour, because there was no information in them. And when you get really silent bits in tracks, you get that little line, don't you? and they became really obsessed with this. And how does that work? Amazing.
Yeah. So they're like that. But whereas I think, I mean, I have all sorts of issues with Spotify, as a lot of people do, but I'm thoroughly addicted to it, despite all that. So yeah, it was all you know, like most people probably. My relationship with music at that age was completely magical all the time.
So just give us quickly the jump into the music press. How did you get started there? And
I was always reading it. I was always reading it. I used to get smash hits every fortnight, reserved in the. I mean, this is this world that's gone. You know, reserved in the newsagent. Do you remember this?
Shop saved.
Yeah.
Shop saved.
Yes.
And I almost read that at the same time as I was reading the NME and Melody Maker. And then my mum, who's a teacher, who taught Johnny Marr from the Smiths in Wythenshawe, maths and chemistry. There was someone in one of her classes who would give me back copies of sounds. I remember that. My mum would come home with back copies of sounds. So I was a sort of creature of that, really, from the age of 11 or 12 onwards. And then I had an enforced, they didn't call it a gap year then, it was called a year out, and I didn't really know what to do. So I was working part-time in a pub, and I thought I should have a go at sending something in. I just thought, I think I must have read somewhere that that's what you did. So I sent, I think, NME, I sent a review of the Wonder Stuff, which wasn't very good at all. My review, not the Wonder Stuff. But and then I sent Sounds a review of Happy Mondays when I saw them play at the Hacienda in 89, I think. And a guy called Sean Phillips, who now works for The Times. I mean, I'm sure this happened to both of you. He then phoned me up and said, do you want to do some writing for us?
That's precisely it, yeah.
Well, yeah.
And I can remember just wanting to go out and just swing around a lamppost. I was so thrilled. And the first thing I had in a music press, they spelt my name wrong, but it didn't matter. I was just incredibly excited.
You remember going in the newsagent on the Wednesday morning, trembling, and then picking up the thing and going, is it here? Is it here? You know? Yeah, it was amazing. It was a lovely, lovely thing. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation about how much I miss it and how many people came through that route and all of that. But that's what happened. Yeah. So I then I went to university in Oxford, and I would write a live review every week. And then I started doing album reviews and then features, and then Sounds closed, and I nearly stopped doing it. But then Steve Lamacq phoned me up at the NME, and I went to work for them.
So what year would that be, roughly?
And I went to work for the NME, 92.
Yeah. All right, okay.
What a good time to be at the NME.
Who was the editor then?
Danny Kelly for a bit.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it was.
So Andrew Collins and Stuart McConey and
all of that lot were there, yeah.
And you all decamped.
What the Manic Street Preachers call the golden generation. I don't include myself in that, incidentally. McConey and Andrew Collins and Quantic.
Right, of course.
Mac. James Brown had just gone off to Found Loaded not long before.
Right.
Marianne Hobbs was there. There's loads of people. And
then you all decamped to EMAP, and it was Q Magazine and Select, wasn't it?
That's when I first met you, Mark. Yeah.
It was.
Yeah, I thought I was in a hurry, probably needlessly. And so I thought I'd done my 3 years at the Music Weeklies or at NME, and you lot were in the West End. And I'll tell you what did that actually was I was at some music convention or another, and the late and much missed David Kavanagh, Adrian Devoy and Bill Prince were all there representing Q. And they all had black denim jackets on, as I recall. This may not be true, but this is the way I remember it. And they were all drinking Beck's. It was a thing then. And I thought, you lot look pretty cool. I might have to go and try and work where you're working. And and in the summer of 95, I came over at the West End, where there were sandwich shops and glamorous people, unlike the South Bank, where there was none of those.
You couldn't get a cappuccino on the South Bank.
Couldn't get anything. There was a funny little pub and a sort of convenience store that sold stale baguettes. It was nothing like it is now. The NME was in this middle of an absolute sort of retail desert. It was a
Stamford Street.
Yeah.
So do you look back on your days on the music press like so many people do? It's like being at college or something.
Yes,
like
that's exactly the analogy I was about to use.
It was. It's like a subsidised, you're doing what you want to do and somebody's kind of vaguely paying you for it. And your entire social life is also caught up in it too.
Yeah. And also, by some fluke, I think people of my age, so I was sort of in my 20s really when all of this happened, we were involved in the music press when it was the last phase of London being sort of affordable and you could sort of treat it as a playground, which you can't now. It's impossible, you know. I mean, even by the early 2000s, people who were in their 20s, early 20s, who worked for the music magazines were all living in Catford and places way out. And I could walk, you know, I was living for 55 quid a week in Hoxton and I could walk to work. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a lovely coincidence of, I want to sound smug about it, it's a lovely coincidence of timing, really. And you're right. And the other thing is, it was important for various reasons, but I think in the sort of context of the wider media, it was important because you learned how to write. Didn't have this situation of people who were 22 thinking they could be, you know, current affairs columnists, because you can't really do that. It was a place to sort of find out who you were and get taught things, I mean, about interviews and how layout works and all of that, you know. It was just a fantastic learning experience.
And also,
you worked in offices with people. So Mark and I often talk about this nowadays, that you learn so much by overhearing people's phone conversations, all that stuff, which nobody does anymore.
Oh yeah. Also enforced. I mean, we may come on to this, but a lot of us had pretty hopeless social skills, you know. But you had to be able to have a telephone conversation, sometimes at quite great length. And sometimes quite, you know, delicate. If someone had put the band on the cover and stitched you up, then someone had to make the phone call and say, hello, why have you done this? This is outrageous.
It required enormously sophisticated skills. I can remember this must have been only 12, 13 years ago at Word magazine. I remember we had a work experience girl there and the phone would go. And I realised that she had never answered a phone for the call from someone who she didn't know was ringing.
Yeah.
Because every phone call she'd ever had was on a thing and it told her who was ringing. And the idea of picking up a phone and talking to a complete stranger was just completely a whole new world. Really interesting.
It was Steve Lamacq. This is a good thing. Steve Lamacq and Simon Williams, who was they were sort of double act who ran the live reviews desk at the NME. They had this sort of thing of sort of Maoist politeness. So if you answered the phone and were grumpy, you'd get a bit of a dressing down for it. And you had to be heard to answer the phone. If the phone rang, you had to say NME live desk and be nice, be well adjusted and nice to people. You know, don't be like some corporate horrible wanker who's very haughty with people, you know. So it was, you learn.
That's good advice.
Yeah, you learn in among all these, we all were in various ways, sort of social misfits and waifs and strays, you sort of learned how to be a functioning human being in some way. That's true.
But also timing-wise, what a great time to be editing Smash Hits, Select. You know, right in the middle of Britpop. I was just listening to the Today programme this morning. It's the 30th anniversary of the Bends. You think that was a brilliant time to be in the music press?
It was. It was really nice for as long as it lasted. And then when it started to go wrong, it all got a bit more difficult. But you're right.
And where did it go wrong? Or when?
A third Oasis album.
Right.
You know, when it went, I mean, in my opinion, when there were two sort of, I'm sure I know because I listened to it the other day, when you talked to Miranda, this was sort of one of the underlying themes in your conversation about Britpop. But the first bit of it was quite sort of Roxy and Bowie and art schooly, Suede, Elastica, Blur, Pulp, right? And then the post-Oasis wave of it was very commercially successful and you had to cover it and write about it and kind of celebrate it. But it wasn't nearly as sort of artistically rich, in my opinion. It wasn't nearly as exciting. It was very conservative. And I sort of got swept along by it. But I sort of, in retrospect, I should have been listening to Massive Attack and I was listening to Cast and Cooler Shaker and I slightly regret. But that was how it was. Another bunch of Herberts with guitars. Let's whack them on the cover.
It was. There's some pretty lame stuff towards the end. But look, just getting onto the book, your son James, how old is he now?
James is 18.
He's 18. And you talk, again, very movingly in the book about him being diagnosed as autistic. And how old was he when that happened?
He was 3. He just turned 3.
Did you had some kind of suspicions that
yeah, but we were, Ginny and I, so that's another thing about the music press we haven't mentioned. It was in the days before internet dating, it was
so where you met your wife.
Yes. Where you met your other half,
that's
right?
It.
And there was this sort of absurd level of the differentiation of gender roles, so that most, not all, but most press officers were women, and most, but not all, journalists were men.
That's true, yeah.
And so a hell of a lot of us met our significant others in the course of work, you know. And Ginny worked at Parlophone. In fact, the morning I met her, I was with you, Mark. I walked down Oxford Street and beyond to go to the Savoy Hotel where they were launching Free as a Bird, the Beatles comeback single, an anthology.
Oh, wow.
Do you remember that?
I remember going to that, yeah.
I walked down the street with you and
ran into Ginny.
And she was handing out promo CDs and I think little Beatles badges at the end. And I thought, you look nice and you're giving me free Beatles records.
And did you have to think, is she being nice to me because I'm a person who might write about one of her acts, or does she like me? Did you have to go through that?
I was never that cynical, David, I have to tell you. Any attention was a bonus, frankly.
Oh, that's good.
So yeah, that's James's mum. So where were we? I can't remember.
We were just talking about him. When did you first realise that music was an important, important thing?
So the
for him?
two
Did you
things
play him some certain songs and he reacted?
So the music, the understanding that he had this tremendous appetite for music preceded the beginnings of us worrying, frankly, about aspects of him that later were sort of bundled up in this diagnosis of autism. So, I mean, I'm sure you did this with your kids as well. It was just, if you're a football fan, you get your kids into football, right? And if you're a music obsessive, then I sort of thought, well, isn't this great? There's this new person here who I can play all this music to. And so that's what happened. But it would have happened anyway, because we just said, I'm one of those people, and I'm sure you are, I have music on all the time,
Yeah, but it's interesting. Again, Mark and I want to talk about this because music's on all the time in our house, always has been. But I've never had a conversation with my children about it, ever.
Wow.
Apart from, unless it's been one that they've started, which has been rare. Because they just took it for granted it was there all the time.
Well, the one thing I learned very quickly is to never over-enthuse about it.
Yes.
If I sort of said, God, I think you really like Joni Mitchell, they would immediately run fast as possible in the opposite direction. So I'd often play things down and said, I know some people like this, have a go. But if they ever discovered things on their own, that was really important. But you just leave them hanging around and hope they would,
Yeah, I've never had... I mean, James subsequently, which we might talk about, has sort of gone off on these journeys of his own. But basically, I had an iPod. And it took me a long time to buy one. I was thinking before we started this that Word magazine, which I was a great fan of, was big on the sort of iPod discourse, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah.
While the iPod discourse was around. And there was an interview with Paul Weller, I think, in Word magazine, where he said, it must have been a white iPod. He said it was like a mini fridge with no beers in it. It looked like a little fridge. And he wasn't having it. And I sort of saw where he was coming from. I was quite sort of hung up about objects and all that stuff. And also, people's just, you can remember this, can't you? People would say, isn't it amazing? You put it on a random playlist and you're walking through a graveyard and Monster Mash comes on. It's so weird. It's like it knows what you're doing and all. Do you remember all that?
Yeah, oh yeah.
So I was quite sort of skeptical about it. Anyway, then I sort of gave in and bought it. And of course, it was completely miraculous. And what a thing. Especially because they had cover flow in those days. So this little, like a CD jukebox in a pub, it looked exactly the same.
Yeah.
And my son James was like 1.5, 2, and he would listen intently to music, and he would repeat some of my phrases that I used after songs. So I would put on a song and it was finished, and he'd go, "That's pretty amazing," which is what I would always say after it's finished. And then he got hold of the iPod and he taught himself how to use it. He didn't need any input from me. And this is when he was barely 2 years old. He sussed out the click wheel and, the layers of it, albums, artists, songs. I found out quite soon after that he was sight reading words, because the tracks that didn't have album art with them, he was still finding his way to them. So he must have had some sense that the words "I am the walrus" got him to "I am the walrus." And then I wrote down "I am the walrus" and held it up on a piece of paper. And he went, "I am the walrus." I was like, "Okay, let's try another one." And I wrote "Hey Jude" or something, and I held that up, and he went, "Hey Jude." And then I wrote Sainsbury's down, and I held that up, and he went, "Sainsbury's." And I thought, "Oh my God,
that's extraordinary."
So this was all going on. This sort of facility with the iPod in particular. And he would quite obsessively, I mean, probably like you, I've got about 75 Beatles books, and he would kind of quite ritualistically go and get the same one down every morning and find the Magical Mystery Tour bus, and that was then complete, and he would then go downstairs. Lots of this stuff going on.
And he liked the intros of songs, didn't he? He played Magical Mystery Tour, and he just would play just the very beginning bit over and over and over again.
Yeah,
why was that, do you think?
I had no idea at the time.
Yeah.
So he would, with "I Am the Walrus," for example, which there's one chapter in the book named after it. I should just hold this up so people know what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Quite Beatlesy art there. With "I Am the Walrus," he would play sort of the first 20 seconds up to the point the vocal starts. So the strings come in, and then just when it got to "I Am He," he would stop. And he'd go back and he'd play it again. And he'd play it 15 or 20 times, at any given sitting. It's quite infuriating. It's a bit like, oh God, can you stop, But he was sort of exploring it, because then he'd go a bit beyond that, and he'd get to the first chorus. And then over the course of about 3 months, he'd get to the end, and then he'd start playing the whole thing. And this happened with a lot of songs. And I didn't know what it was. And then this was a pretty stressful, worrying, grim time for Ginny and I, because we just moved house and we just had our daughter. And when James was diagnosed with autism, as you know, is a very diverse thing, the way it presents. And there are some people who don't use this term anymore, but who have Asperger's syndrome, say, whose language isn't affected, and who, with the right support, can do well at school and all that. In a sort of not normal way, but in a reasonably accomplished way. James's autism was much more sort of intense. That's a good word. And it's woven through with some learning disabilities and so on. So it was quite a thing, It was obvious that his life was going to be quite different, or very, very different, actually, from what it would have been if he'd been a neurotypical child. And that just got dropped on us suddenly. This diagnosis happens. You spend 2 or 3 months seeing these people who come around your house and do these developmental tests, and you go and see a pediatrician and all that. And in the course of that, the sort of gravity of it hit us repeatedly like a hammer, And that time was really hard. And so, and all those lovely quirky things, as we've just talked about, and the fact that he had this precocious reading ability, the magic suddenly got taken out of those, because they were just all part of this thing that had been dropped on us. But human beings, I discovered, I didn't know this, are quite good. If once you start asking yourself the question, well, what should I do? Once you leave the mood of introspection and why has this happened to me and what does it all mean? When you go into what am I going to do? Then the magic of all these talents and interests on James's part return quite quickly. And, and then beyond the Beatles, his taste started going to places that were fascinating and also, in the most beautiful, brilliant way, were really funny. I had this 3-year-old child who was obsessed with Ian Hunter from Mock the Hoop. You know what I mean?
Yes. he was obsessed with "Hello" at the beginning of Once Bitten, Twice Shy.
And eventually the whole song. Once Bitten, Twice Shy, Ian Hunter's first solo single from 1975, which opens, as you say, David, he says, "Hello."
Hello. It's a novelty record again.
Yeah. You know why he says hello?
Go on.
Because Saturday gigs, the last Mock the Hoople song, the last words you hear are goodbye, goodbye.
All right.
So now he's saying hello.
Perfect.
It all makes sense.
These things matter. And so he would poodle around the house to Once Bitten, Twice Shy by Ian Hunter. And then he found All the Way from Memphis and You're Never Alone with a Schizophrenic, which is a great album. So
was he recognizing the sound, or was he pursuing the name? He decided he liked Ian Hunter and therefore he was looking for
both, really. So the initial kind of thing that pulled him in was the song. And then because he could read and he was amazingly skilled with iTunes and iPods, he'd then find some other stuff, as one would, It was, so, and I could see myself in this, you see. If you're looking for if you just had all this stuff dropped on you about your kid is autistic and this is going to be really difficult and you're going to have to get all this extra support and you might not get it and you're going to have to fight. All of this was very onerous and fretful. But straight away, I could see myself. Age 5, the me who had heard Within You, Without You on side 2 of Sergeant Pepper and been bowled over. I could see this happening. Oh, I know what's happening here, right? And so that was how it worked. And it was just joyous. It was really joyous. And it got us out of this sort of horrible black hole of despair, really. And what a thing. And then I said to Ginny, God, isn't it great? What a coincidence that we've got this child with all these musical appetites and it so happens we have all this music. And of course she said, no, no, this is much more intertwined than that. And of course, I've subsequently come to the realization that my obsessiveness and my openness to music and my focus on detail when I hear it and so on, that's all part of the genetic material that was passed on to James and then formed one part of what we call autism. Definitely.
There's a bit later on where you talk about how children with autism can hear songs differently each time. You said music is an endlessly replenishable source of wonder.
Yeah.
Explain that. It's fascinating.
So this goes back to why he doesn't do it so much now, but why did James listen to I Am the Walrus over and over again? So once I started writing the book, one of the lovely things about it was that effectively I was getting paid in its early stages to go and talk to a handful of people who really know a lot about autism. And as much as anything else, ask them about aspects of James that by that point I'd lived with for, 13 or 14 years. And I went to see this fella called Adam Ockleford, who's he's a composer and musicologist. I think he wouldn't mind that description. And he works out of Roehampton University. And he's written a book about music and autism. And he does music workshops with autistic people. And it was him who said to me that as far as he could tell, and he would know, when many autistic people listen to music, the capacity it has to amaze and enthrall and all of that doesn't fade with exposure to it. Now, I think that applies to a lot of us, actually. I don't think that's a uniquely autistic thing. Familiarity does sometimes breed contempt, but when I put on the intro of Satisfaction, that still hits me like a hammer or a thunderbolt. It still does. But James obviously had that in spades. So it looked like what some people who know about autism call rigid and repetitive behavior. But in retrospect, I'm not sure it was. I think he just found it astounding. And of course, I Am the Walrus is astounding. It's bonkers. It's brilliant. And he would find that every time he returned to it. And then once I discovered that James has got absolute pitch, which only 1 in 10,000 neurotypical people have. But
yeah, that's fascinating.
So you
play him any song and he can tell you what key it's written in.
I went downstairs and got the guitar, which I knew was tuned right. And this is while I was writing the book. I just thought, I wonder, And I got the guitar out and went, "What's this, James?" Ding. And he goes, "A." Oh, wow. And me and his sister watched this happen. We were both laughing, And then I thought, well, what about the black notes? Then I went, "What's this, James?" Ding. And he goes, "B flat." Oh, okay. Now, can you imagine hearing music with that level of information in it?
Well, again, there's a point where you're saying that you think he might be hearing all sounds as notes. So you're talking about birds.
Oh, he can do it.
Car engines and lawnmowers. He can.
He can do it.
The beep
in the checkout in Lidl, I think, is C.
Wow.
And I only know that because he told me.
Yeah.
So that denotes the fact that he and lots of other autistic people are hearing music with a level of depth and detail that's absolutely incredible. Now, that has downsides. When James hears a police siren, it causes him a great deal of distress, right?
Right.
Or barking dogs are another one. Because he's very sensitized. Some autistic people, you see, have to wear ear defenders.
Yes, isn't it? Because and modern life is increasingly noisy and chaotic, isn't it?
Yeah, I empathize. So this is another little entrail of some of this sort of genetic material that's in me. I don't know about you. I can't cope with extraneous noise. I can't cope with people whistling. I want to strangle them. or drumming their fingers on tabletops.
We thought that was just a northern thing.
Yeah, that does seem extremely unaccommodating, but
shut up! What are you doing that for? Or extractor fans in hotels. Can't cope with it. But James has that. James has that on stilts. But the lovely manifestation of it is that he clearly hears things in music which mere mortals don't, and that's why he's so drawn to it, and it has such a transcendent effect on him.
Right.
And he has this wonderful ability to memorize things. I think particularly from things like Wikipedia, where he may not necessarily know what he's saying. I think you'll put on a Clash record, he'll say something like, the Clash's sophomore album from 1978 on CBS Records called Give Enough Rope, or whatever it was.
He knows what that means. It's into this larger thing. But when I went in Piccadilly Records in Manchester with him, and I know him in there, it was the first time he'd been in Piccadilly Records. And before I'd even got to, this is my son James, he got Give Him Enough Rope out. It's interesting you mentioned that. I got Give Him Enough Rope out, second Clash album, pulls it out, runs up to the counter, fixes this guy behind the counter with a very fierce look, and he says, "This is the Clash's second album, released on CBS Records in March 1978, produced by the guy from Blue Oyster Cult." And the guy's going, "What? How did this happen?"
That's amazing. And didn't he memorize great sections of the dialogue of Toy Story, I think, as well? Was it Toy Story? Yeah, without necessarily understanding what the story meant, but he just memorized the words.
At that point, less so now, but at that point, there's a theory about autism which is called weak central coherence, which is essentially that you can see the trees, but the wood is a much more difficult proposition. So context and stories and all that, kind of harder to fathom. But in general, a lot of autistic people have amazing memories, and when that fuses with this focus on detail, you can see then again that's another part of James's musicality. I mean, going back to I Am the Walrus, it's quite hard to follow that song because it's written by John Lennon, so some bars are a weird length and it takes turns you don't think it's going to, and the third chorus doesn't have woo in it and all of that. It's very hard to follow. But after 2 or 3 listens, he just knew it, kind of verbatim, so to speak, all the way through. Which again, that's just an amazing. It's not just about the experience of hearing music in the moment; it's how much he retains. Do
you think any of this is a reflection on the kind of increasingly busy and information-packed modern life? That you think back to probably when you were younger. You have to go out and find excitement, whereas you're now surrounded by stimuli, aren't you?
Yeah.
Do you think that has any effect on the condition and the increasing talk about it?
In what sense? What, like how much of it there is around?
Well, there is so much. If you take music, there are just millions of pieces of music that you hear in an average day nowadays that 40 years ago people didn't.
No, of course. I mean, that's just a little. I mean, in my case, I have nothing but positive and benign feelings about that, because it's another. Apart from the invention of digital technology, which has meant that James has this sort of way into the world which wouldn't have existed 40 or 50 years ago. The sheer profusion of music, which you're right can be really confusing and bewildering, but for him, I mean, that's how he found his way to. I don't think he'd have found his way to magazine. I didn't show him magazine. I mean, Howard Devoe.
You mean the group? Yeah.
Yeah. And suddenly I come in and he's
was that just from scrolling?
Well, it's via an iPod, isn't it?
Via an iPod or on Spotify.
All the music in the world, we've all got the same record.
Also, algorithmically, I suppose, he would have been listening to The Clash or something, and there would have been a magazine radio or one of those things on Spotify. So
yes, of course, all those things will.
And I quite like magazine, but I didn't own any of their records. And then suddenly I get home and he's playing The Light Pours Out of Me and Shot by Both Sides all day.
Yes. So yes, those sinister algorithms are benign as well.
They're quite good, yeah. And what we haven't said is he's got brilliant taste. I can say that safely. I really can. He doesn't pick bad music.
That's good parenting, I would say.
No, I don't know, because as I say in the book, as I've said in the book, there was some things that weren't very good on the iPod that he could have. I think there was. I say this in the book. There was 6 tracks by the Kooks, God love them, and who let the dogs out and things like that. And I Like to Move It, I think was on there. And he didn't hammer those.
Right.
So it remains this great thing. You know, when he turns around and says, get playing on the keyboard, and he plays a song and I go, what's that? And he says, Outdoor Miner by Wire. It's like, oh, further proof that you have impeccable taste.
And a lot of his response is emotional, isn't it? There's a wonderful bit where you talk about him. Well, he discovers Kraftwerk, and that's interesting too, because Ralph Hutter had always said, people think of the keyboard, the synthesizer as being an unemotional instrument. Utterly untrue. He says it's far more emotional than guitar. But James, one point you ask him what mood people were in when they composed certain songs.
Yeah.
And he tell us about that. It's really interesting. He just comes up instantly with an adjective. If it's Ace of Spades, Motorhead goes angry or whatever, doesn't he? I think.
Yeah. So autistic people, or many autistic people, it's almost one of the sort of basic features of autism is that reading emotions in things like facial expression and tone of voice is really hard.
Yeah.
Now I understand that, sight unseen, it is quite hard, but it's a talent or a skill most of us acquire. It might be that it's wired in from the start, but it's there in most people, and autistic people have issues with that very often. But there is a part of the cutting edge of knowledge or research into autism. And a lot of this is very tentative. One of the things I was struck by meeting people is you say to them, well, do we know this about autism? People said, well, we don't know.
No.
Because people only started looking into this concertedly in the early 80s at the earliest. So it's all a work in progress. But academic work has been done that suggests that whereas facial expressions and tone of voice and stuff are quite difficult to read emotionally for autistic people, music carries emotions in a much more certain and secure way to autistic people. And again, it was during lockdown and I was bored. So I thought, let's find this out. And as you say, I played James a succession of songs. What Becomes of the Broken Hearted by Jimmy Ruffin, and a Billie Eilish one, and Motorhead, and All Right by Supergrass, and said, how are these people feeling? And he got them all right. Happy, sad, excited. I mean, and you're a typical person might have gone a bit deeper and said, oh, I don't know, pensive or reflective or whatever. Yeah. But it definitely carries emotion much more securely to James than those other things do.
You wonder if you can sense something about the people writing the songs, because you make the point that that a lot of musicians are outsiders. They're people we think of as weird or eccentric or introverted or they don't quite fit in or whatever. And there's a list of songs, I'm not like everybody else and people are strange. And, there is a certain thing about a lot of musicians being quite comforting if you feel like an outsider yourself.
I'm very glad you mentioned this, Mark. So yesterday when I was wondering what you might ask me, I thought you might ask me about this, because all three of us have the shared experience of meeting lots of musicians.
Yeah.
For a start. But then also I know, David, the book you wrote about the rock, one of your books is about the rock star, isn't it?
Yeah.
And kind of who they are and the fact that world has probably gone, but what it was that denoted what being a rock star was. And once I'd really started to think hard about James's autism and how it sat with this tremendous appetite and for music and talent, because he plays as well. He plays the bass and keyboards and stuff. Of course, I would then start thinking about musicians in general, right? And this isn't about saying this or that musician is autistic. That's not it. It's not nearly as crude and crass as that. It's about what psychologists call a cognitive style. And I only had to think about this for a matter of minutes and think, well, I met a lot of people who had these virtuosic skills and, who could instantly find their way around a recording studio, but who were very often quite introverted and socially awkward, loners very often, and also who weren't great at what psychologists call executive function, which is planning how you get from A to B to C, right?
Yes.
And then you think, oh, that's what a tour manager does.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
Because they go, Dave, lobby in 15, and they go, oh, where's my shoes? Right. And we all think, oh, it's because they're off their nuts on drugs and all that.
No.
And I thought, no, maybe not. Maybe some of them, it's not that. It's the fact that they have this parallel set of aptitudes and then things they find difficult, right? And the things they find difficult will be, I have to be in the lobby at 9 o'clock with my case packed, knowing that I'm going to Portland, Oregon. And where's the tour itinerary? Someone gets paid to do that for a reason, right?
Yes.
And there's a reason why so many guitar players are loners, lead guitar players are loners. There's a reason why John Coltrane practiced the saxophone for 16 hours a day, which mere mortals can't do, right? It's because they're made
monotropism, isn't it? It's
monotropism, which is this, there's one central set of thoughts in your head at any given time, and you're completely immersed in it, and woe betide anyone who tries to pull you out. I'm quite like that, but I've met a lot of musicians who are very, very like that. And that's why autism's still in the gene pool, right? So the person in the village who spent 10 days in the cave rubbing two sticks together until they came down the mountain and said, I've done it, lads, was probably autistic.
Well, you keep making the point that we should be more sympathetic. You know, it's like Prince not going to the recording of We Are the World because he said he would feel uncomfortable with all those people there. And you're thinking, actually, you know, we should understand that. You know, we shouldn't just sit there and think he's being antisocial or he's being high and mighty or haughty or whatever. I mean, it's just these are problems, you know.
Totally. I mean, God knows, Mark, you all used to organise the Q Awards and sort of, you know, you put on this lavish thing and in come all these people who, many of whom don't really know how to navigate their way around it. Who would, you know, but it's... Socializing is a sort of difficult sell. Being in each other's company is a difficult sell.
They're usually accompanied by a person whose job is to kind of mediate between them and the world, isn't it?
Right.
Obviously, you can't go and get a cup of tea on your own. You're Eric Clapton or whatever. You know, I'm going to do it for you.
But by the same token, even if they didn't have that person there, they might not have an issue with knowing exactly how to get there, despite the fact that they're an amazing guitar player, right?
Yeah.
But the problem with the music industry among 9,000 is that they take these people who very often have this cognitive style and they make them do the absolute opposite of what they want to do, what they feel comfortable with. So this person then has to go to 16 American college radio stations and say, "Hey, how you doing? Nice to be here in Newport, Rhode Island." And then we've got a meet and greet with Artie Fufkin later and you know, album signing. Now, Mick Jagger, right, I think he has more than enough of these social skills. You know, there are musicians who are very good at this, right? But there are lots and lots who are really bad at it. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why lots of successful musicians get drug habits and have nervous breakdowns. There's this cognitive awkwardness. It doesn't fit.
It's like Van Morrison always wanted to be sat at tables whereby there are people all around him, so no member of the public can possibly pass by and tell him how much his music has meant to them or whatever, you know.
Yeah.
And I remember that I used to think that was kind of ridiculous, but in a way you could just understand that, you know, these guys are just they find all that kind of interaction so difficult.
Most rudimentary rock biographies. Not all, but, you know, you pick them up and this apply. I mean, I try to listen to Astral Weeks once a year and it still doesn't work. I apologize. But I got a Van Morrison biography and it didn't take very long to find that they said that he was just, he couldn't cope with socializing. And when he moved to Woodstock, he found it impossible to connect with anybody and all of that. And it looks to me, I don't know, like, and again, this isn't about diagnosing people. It just looks to me like that's what comes along with this level of creative brilliance very often.
Well, it's like, you know, Brian Wilson being able to hear hymns when he was 9 years old and memorize the entire thing and sort of just and sing them, you know, absolutely extraordinary. But there are a couple of musicians you mentioned who have claimed that they are autistic, aren't they? David Byrne is one, and I think Gary Newman's the other.
Yeah, they're both.
How would you think that would express itself in those two particularly? I mean, if that's
when I've watched films of David Byrne being asked about it. And he's self-diagnosed, but he talks about it in terms of focus. You know, when he's in the recording studio, if he's got to spend 12 hours putting the synth pad underneath the song that nobody else apart from him can hear, he can do that. And when David Byrne gets into things, he really gets into them, doesn't he? You don't make a record like My Life in the Bush of Ghosts unless you're really into something. He's not a dilettante at all. I mean, starting his label, Oakabop, which is sort of world music label, isn't it?
Yeah.
That denotes to me someone who's an extreme enthusiast.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that, I mean, you know, sight unseen, I'd say they were probably two of those things. And Gary Numan, I've seen talking about the fact that he just finds social situations and stuff quite difficult to read. And yet, again, you know, he's obviously no slouch musically. And perhaps elements of that sort of introverted, asocial persona he used to his advantage. That's sort of part of the image he presents to the world almost.
Yeah.
But, you know, the music business is just about waking up to this now. This is mentioned in the book, Universal Music did this sort of internal document for all their employees, basically saying to them, you're going to meet a lot of neurodivergent people in the course of your working life, so be nice to them, please. Because they make us all our money.
That's right. That's very interesting. Have you still got the group with James? Performed at the school?
Yeah, although he's sort of, this goes back to what you said about your kids not really...
There's a point where you don't want to be in a band with your dad.
So yeah, James is adolescent like any other adolescent, and he's less keen on playing music with me than he used to be. So is his sister, who's a brilliant drummer. But he goes every Friday. There's by some amazing stroke of luck, 6 miles down the road, there's a youth club for neurodivergent kids, a musical youth club. And you know, there's a drummer there and a bass player and a guitar player and lots of kids who aren't that musical but go because it's a social opportunity. And James goes every week and in the interval plays Shot by Both Sides and Oasis songs and Children of the Revolution and what have you. That's what happens.
Fantastic. Well, the book ends on such an upbeat note. You know, things have improved so enormously and music's been such a big part of that. And it's a really valuable book too. I can imagine a lot of people who are in similar situations will really, I'm going to give it to some friends of mine and I know they're going to get a lot from it, you know. It's a terrific book. John, it's been so nice to talk to you.
That's a real pleasure. You're the first interview I've done for the book.
Very good. Well, I really hope it does well and it deserves to. It's brilliant. And as I say, again, it's called Maybe I'm Amazed, a story of love and connection in 10 songs by John Harris. John, brilliant to see you.